Welcome everyone. I'm your host. I'm Roger Simpson. I'm the director of Lodi UK. We're streaming live from our offices here in the West Midlands. I'm joined by Sam in our meeting or broadcasting room. Sam's our marketing manager and tech guru. I've also got Kate, who's our assistant marketing manager. She's working from home. She's reporting on this webinar for a few publications, but also creating a 16-page show guide that we'll be sending out post this event. So that'll be coming to you in the next 3 to 4 weeks. As you know, this is a BASIS and BPCA event. So those of you who've signed up on our website, we will be providing your details to BASIS and BPCA in order for you to be awarded your CPD points. So that's great. May I just say thank you to all of you for joining us. I know it's a very, very busy part of the farming calendar, so we really do appreciate that you've taken an hour of your time to join us for this event. And I've got a live map in front of me that is working, and it's quite fantastic actually. We've got guys viewing from Isle of Man, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, so all parts of the UK, England of course. I've got someone in Mexico, Sweden, Germany, France. So great. Yeah, lovely to have you. And it's a really mixed bunch. We've got farmers, we've got agronomists, we've got suppliers, we've got pest controllers, manufacturers and competitors. So thank you all for joining. You're all very, very welcome. Okay, now to the real business. Got a great list of speakers for you. I would say they're some of the biggest expertise in the industry. So the first speaker is Ken from Bayer CropScience, who's going to do a 15-minute talk on grain store hygiene. He's got 11 years working at Bayer and involved in agriculture all his life. Then we're joined by Mark of Command Pest Control, founded Command Pest Control in 1986 and now has over 60 technicians. He's one of the leading agricultural pest control companies. And Mark, well done. You were granted the royal warrant from Her Majesty the Queen just 2 years ago. So well done for that. And a little bit of information. He is the landlord. He bought his local village pub dating back to 1416. So he's the landlord of his local. And then we've got a nice little 10-minute slot from Dan Shaw of Cotswolds Distillery, one of very few English distilleries out there, founded in 2014. So yes, welcome Dan. I look forward to his speech. Then we have a live Q&A. So the whole idea being that whilst these presentations are happening, you are able to submit any questions that you may have. And if you submit those, we will collect them and then we will pose them to our Q&A panel, live Q&A panel. On the panel will be Ken, Mark, and we're very, very happy to be joined by Tom Martin, or otherwise known as Farmer Tom. Tom's a mixed sheep and arable farmer in Cambridgeshire, but also founder of the charity Farmer Time, telling kids and children more about farming and all the things about farming, and he'll tell us more about that when we get there. He's also a wild water swimmer, as you can see there. So great. I think we've got great expertise, decades of experience. Hopefully we'll give you good information on how to protect your grain stores from pests and ensure you're looked after. So I think we're ready. I think that's enough of me and we're good, and we can hand over to Ken.
Good morning.
Ken, are you there? Are you there, Ken?
Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction, Roger.
Yeah, no, expand, please. I feel like we're doing the Eurovision, we're calling in a new country, but Ken, over to you.
Thank you. So first slide, please, Sam. There we go. So I'm just going to, Sam is going to put me up a series of slides that really are more thought-provoking than going into any great technical detail on this. And the purpose of what I want to talk to you about is just where grain storage preparation fits in to the overall year on an arable farm. Some people consider it really important. Some people mixed views on it, other people don't bother at all. Just trying to really bring it all together and emphasize how important it is. So a series of pictures there. I mean, nothing rocket science in them, and nothing that you won't know. And apologies if I'm teaching suck eggs here, but I wanted to put together or present it as a bit of a jigsaw, the growing season jigsaw, where as a producer, you start with your seed selection, your varieties, you attend manufacturers' demo days, you had chem suppliers, demo days, even cereals event. That was a long time ago, it feels like now, but hopefully we'll get back to that soon. Preparation of the seedbed, the establishment of the crop, dealing with the weather, the extremes, the wetness, the drought. You take on advice from the agronomists, who are incredibly knowledgeable people, a wealth of knowledge, and you rely on those as producers heavily. Applications of fertilizer, the crop's nurtured through its growing period, through the T1s, T2s, T3s, all that kind of terminology. Of course, you're presented with crop disease, crop insect pests, and of course the dreaded weeds. The inputs that you put in, costly, lots of sprays. But eventually you get to the point where you're ready to harvest. And once you're at that point, the combines roll, and a lot of people, it's job done. That's it, growing season finished, the crop is in the store, and in the words of Henry Alford, all is safely gathered in. And all we then have to worry about, of course, is the winter storms beginning. Very different, I think, in reality, because I think that in that growing season jigsaw, there's a piece missing. And that piece that's missing, I believe, is grain storage preparation. I think it's underestimated. It's not a popular job on the farm. Nobody likes doing it. It's time consuming. It often comes at a time on the farm where you're incredibly busy. You're getting ready for harvest. There's lots of other things going on. But I just want you to look at this quote from a study that was carried out at Colorado State University about 10 years ago. It's quite an interesting statement. Stored grain insects often cause as much loss after harvest as crop pests cause during the growing season. I think that's something that really makes you think, or should make you stop and think, that all the work you've put into growing and nurturing and then harvesting that crop to produce a high quality product, where you're aiming to get the best prices in the market, can actually, all that work can be undone by poor or lack of grain store preparation. And that's where I believe that there is a missing piece, and it's an important piece of the overall puzzle and of the growing season. So again, another statement, again from Colorado, is that profits from growing and producing a crop should not be allowed to waste away in storage. So once that crop's in store, quite often the doors are shut. I wouldn't say it's forgotten about, but it's deemed to be job done. And of course, you're then moving on rapidly to autumn cultivations and getting the next crop established for the following year. But I just want you to take a step back, really. And I want you to explain to you the impact of insect infestations. So there's a number of points there, and the impact of insect infestations can be numerous. Physical loss of the commodity by direct consumption. I'll speak to you in a moment about the different types of insects, the different classes. Some of them have the ability to actually damage grains, whole grains, directly. They have mouth parts and they can damage the grains. And once they damage the grain, they then move on to the next. And if you have a huge number of insects in a store because you've not cleaned it out or treated it properly, that is a real risk. What you then get is a snowball effect, the spoilage and loss of quality. Obviously, the more insects that are in there, the more damage is done. Of course, we just mentioned in the jigsaw, the growing season jigsaw, is the time spent producing and storing the commodity. All that work could be quickly undone by insects in your store. The more insects you have, the more chance you have of mold growth, because insects, when they're breeding and reproducing and moving, produce heat. The more heat, the more interaction there is with moisture in the store, and then you get mold growth and other such things. Contamination with insect bodies, major problem. You can have one insect in 1 kilo in a 1 kilo sample of grain and it'll be rejected. And more end market users, buyers are becoming really really picky on insect contamination because some are allergenic, and that's where you get rejection. And ultimately, you're increasing your costs due to the reactive control measures. It's always easier to be proactive and to be ahead of the game in any aspect of the growing season, and in particularly grain storage. So it's about knowing your enemy. You know, the insects that you have in a grain store are entirely different to those that are in the field during harvest. And it's a common question I get asked. Where do they come from? Do the insects come from the field during harvest and into store? And the answer to that is no. So if you take any insects that are in the field, put them into a grain store, they won't survive for any period at all. And likewise, if you took grain storage insects and put them in a field environment, they wouldn't survive because they're not adapted. They're all adapted to the different environments and where they live. So in a grain store, you have primary pests, secondaries, and tertiary pests. And tertiary simply means third in order. So to give you an idea, a quick overview of primary pests and what they're capable of doing, these are the ones with mouth parts that are able to render grains, whole grains, unsuitable for end market use. What they do, they bore in. If we take grain weevil, a good example, they bore into the grain, they lay their eggs within the grain, they then seal that hole up and move on to the next grain. Within that grain, those eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae eats the inside of the grain, incubates into an adult, and it emerges, and so on and so forth. So you have a snowball effect of these insects going through. Secondary pests then feed on the damage. So any damage caused by your primaries, or even damage caused by physical or biological action, so broken or moldy grains, and that can be even coming from your combine being set incorrectly, so it is damaging grains, or grains passing through augers or conveyors that are not full. You then get insects like the red rust flower beetle, the sawtooth, which is well known, and they then feed on that damage. Your tertiary pests, although they can't actually damage grains, they can cause lots of problems in terms of being linked to the primary and secondary pests. So your moths and mites and so on. And they tend to be surface dwellers, and they finish off the snowball. So you could have all three in a store, which is just disastrous. But the common thing that pulls all these insects together is that they all require a food source, so that's your grain. They all require harborage, which is your grain store. And they all, as with any insect in the insect world, require correct temperatures for survival and reproduction. If we can remove or reduce any of these elements as much as is practically possible, then the risk of infestation is significantly reduced. So that's not a very clear picture, but I just thought I'd put that up. At the last event we did, which was the Llama event back in January 2020, on our stand, on the Bayer stand, we always have a selection of insects in little petri dishes. And that one was grain weevils. And after the event, they came home with me. They went into a dark case in a consistent temperature, or held at a constant temperature, and they were opened up earlier this week, just put on a window ledge with a bit of warmth, and 4 grain weevils appeared. And it just demonstrates to me, and it should demonstrate to you, these insects' abilities to survive. So they can overwinter, they can go right down to quite low temperatures, they may go dormant, but they rely on higher, warmer temperatures to start their activity off and reproduction. And that's what we're up against. So it is a major problem. The answer to it, of course, is early grain store preparation. And I'm going to put this out there, and I know some people will come out and say he's not in the real world, but the reality is that the earlier you can prepare a store, clean it out, monitor for insect activity, and treat if necessary, the better. It gives you more opportunity to look at the store, get it right, get it clean. As well as that, clean all the associated equipment. So your combines, your dryer, your handling equipment, anything that may contain dust, debris from previous year has the ability to harbour insects. And they're just waiting for you to put a fresh crop of grain into your store, and then the whole cycle will start again. Thorough cleaning out all the ledges, cracks, crevices, dispose of it as quickly as possible. A number of times I've heard people say they vacuumed and then just let the vacuum in the store overnight, come back in the morning, there's a procession of insects finding their way out to the vacuums. So don't leave it, remove it and burn it, or get rid of it somewhere well away from the store. I talked about monitoring. The earlier you can prepare the store, the more opportunity you have to monitor for insect activity. There's sticky pads on the market which have pheromones that attract the insects. If you've had a historical issue with insects in the store, you may well just decide to take a belt and braces approach and use smokes and an insecticide treatment such as K-Obiol to treat the store. But if you're not seeing any insect activity, the guidance is you may not need to use an insecticide treatment. Where possible, ensure there's no leaks in the roof or the structure of the building. Also, repair any cracks and crevices. That's where the harbourage is. Again, not always possible. A little bit easier in a newer grain store, but if the grain store has been up for a long time, of course, it's not practically possible to fill every crack and crevice in. But the more you can do, the better. Proof against rodent and bird entry. Rodents and birds carry insects from store to store. That's how some of them move from store to store. Other insects just simply walk. They're capable of moving quite large distances from different stores on the farm. They come in on transport. Grain lorries with rollover covers are one of the greatest movers of insects from farm to farm. If time's precious and you haven't got the time to thoroughly clean out the store, consider using a professional pest control company like Command, and Mark will talk about more about the services and what they can offer in a moment or two. But it is critical. It's no good just having a quick sweep round and a quick blow down with a blower. A thorough deep clean is needed, and the target is a contaminant-free environment. That's what we're aiming for. It's important to note, though, that clean insecticide treatments may not eliminate all grain store pests. Almost impossible to get 100% control or eradication on insects in a grain store. Grain drying and cooling are critical. So this is post-harvest. So the grain's in store. You probably don't need me to tell you this, but the reason for it from our point of view is that, as I said earlier, all insects require temperature, and there's perfect temperatures for them to reproduce and grow in numbers. And generally, as a general rule of thumb, most insects breed at their optimum between 25 and 32 degrees C. So the quicker you can cool that grain and get the temperature down, the more you're going to reduce the ability of those insects. Get it down below 15 degrees C, which is the target, the majority of insects won't breed at all. Grain weevils will, and they'll go down to about 12 degrees. If you're lucky and you can get really cold air in there and you get the temperature down below 5, insects don't feed at all and will die. Anywhere between 5 and 15, they'll go into a dormant state. So throughout the storage period, really important not just to shut the doors, and I know again that the majority of growers will be monitoring the grain throughout the storage period, but it's just worth mentioning, the closer you check it, you're looking for temperatures and insect activity. If there's insect activity in a store, you'll see hotspots. As I said earlier, the more activity there is, the more heat is generated. Pitfall traps. I'm sure most of you use them all, but they're a really simple, straightforward way of monitoring. Occasionally get a sieve and go through your store, taking samples and just sieving out the top layers and just seeing what's in there. Ongoing monitoring is critical, as well as pre-harvest, grain storage preparation, the post-harvest considerations are very important. And that's it really from me. So like I say, not rocket science, but just a few thought-provoking slides just to make you think that, you know, pre-harvest grain storage was once the domain of the harvest student and not a popular job on the farm, we know that, but it should be more important and it should fit into the overall growing season jigsaw that I talked about earlier. So take an early proactive approach to grain store prep as early as practically possible. Aim for a contaminant-free environment as much as possible. And following up from that, closely monitor temperature and insect activity post-harvest. And hopefully that will give you a good grain sample and the best prices possible when you come to sell. I hope you found that useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That was great. Thank you. Very, very informative. Can I just say we've had some wonderful photos through, so really pleased you're taking part. And one of the nice things about this webinar is that we've set it up so that you can dial in off your phone. And we wanted that ability due to, you know, we know that a lot of farmers are out there or out in the field, so we wanted the ability that you could dial in off your phone, and we've had some off tractors, so really pleased to see. So please keep sending them in. Also, please send in your questions. We would love to have your questions. Mark, I can see you down there, so like to hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good morning to everybody who's looking in on this. Why do we need pest control? Pest control has changed over the years. When I first started this company 35 years ago, one of my first customers said to me, how many rat droppings per ton of grain is acceptable to the trade? And of course, we know that in the times that we are in now, no pests are acceptable in a food commodity, and rejections will be made if pest problems are found. So the number one pest that attacks grain stores would be rats and mice. And of course, we know that the damage that they can do in chewing wires and causing fires. Rats and mice may cause damage to buildings where there could be expensive rebuilds following a fire. There could be, as I've discussed, grain or rejection. Stock are affected by urine. Rat urine, particularly in water, will often affect the fertility of animals. Pests will cause failure in passing audits. Disease can be passed to humans and domesticated animals from pests. There could also be damage to the stock in there, whatever the stock is storing in your store. There may be contamination with droppings. There may be damage to stored vehicles, tractors, teleporters, electrical items, that sort of thing. And obviously the most expensive piece of equipment we're trying to protect is the combine harvester, which often will stand for several months in a store. It's important that we keep an eye on that to make sure rodents don't get into the combine. Seasonal movement. We all know that probably the third week of September every year, when the nights start to pull in, it gets cold, virtually all the grain has got in. That is when we start getting calls for rats and mice coming into farms, where people start seeing them, particularly if it's with a bit of rain as well. So there's a mass migration in colder weather after harvest. Buildings are sought for shelter and food. All the nowadays after harvest, the stubbles are quickly turned for early drilling for oilseed rape and barleys, winter barleys, etc., winter wheats. So the food source in the fields diminishes very quickly. So rodents have very clearly got buildings in their sites to come and get shelter and food, and they've become ideal places for colonies to breed. Here you see some telltale signs of rodent problems. We've all seen the chewings of doors and the rat runs around the outside of buildings, etc. Again, more pictures, but I've emphasised here on the chewing that rodents do. You can see the top pictures there of good clear runs, which you need to be very aware of, particularly in the winter time. But rodents continually chew to reduce the growth on their incisor teeth, and in doing so, they love to chew pipework and electrical cables. So alkathene pipes in poultry and chicken units, cattle units, wiring in grain stores. I'm sure that it's something everybody wants to avoid. With rats and mice, obviously they breed virtually all the year round, so as soon as they're in, that breeding will start. Planning your pest control. What are the target species that we need to focus on to come up with a program? We've said rats and mice. Important to think of the time when they're going to be most prevalent on the farm. Pigeons, wood pigeons, collared doves, feral pigeons. You get a lot of racing pigeons nowadays that will home in on a bit of spilt grain in grain stores. Store product insects, which we've heard about before, mites, and casual intruders. So, as we've heard before from Bayer, it's important to keep an eye on the grain for any signs of problems. The slide, one slide there, you've got rodent footprints, rat footprints crawling up the grain. It's important to keep an eye on that grain all the time as soon as it's in for anything that looks a little bit untoward. Rodents in grain stores. Controlling rats needs to be focused on all the year round, but particularly in the autumn time. And of course, I would hope that you are all aware of CREW, the campaign for responsible rodenticide usage. It's very important that everybody focuses on that. A few years ago, Brussels were on the verge of a decision to ban rodenticide across Europe, only to be purchased in very, very small amounts, which would have been no good at all for the farming industry. So we have to have a great respect for that and follow the guidelines. It is legislation to ensure that we don't lose critical chemicals in the future for controlling rats and mice. We regularly use non-toxic monitoring. And once activity is noted, toxic bait is used. Once control is achieved, we go back to monitoring again. Rodent control on farms is very seasonal. We're coming into a time now where we shouldn't have too many rodents lurking around. So the monitoring is very important. But as we've said, come September, October, when the rats and mice start to come in, that's when the focus is on more of a control method. There's nothing wrong with other methods of control apart from rodenticide, and of course, sometimes the use of the old-fashioned breakback traps or live catch traps are used as well. As long as you follow the guidelines, and particularly with a live catch trap, they must be checked daily and records must be kept to prove that. Toxic bait is used internally for both rats and mice in harbourages and away from the grain. It's important to use a non-spill rodenticide anywhere near stored grain. And there are several formulations available to enable you to do that. It should be noted that it is no longer acceptable to bait for mice outside with rodenticide. So your toxic bait there should only be targeted for rats when you have a rat problem. Maintenance of the buildings. Years ago, there were you could always have a what I call get out of jail card free, because there were toxic substances around that if you had a pest problem in the building, you could put something down that would knock out the rodent problems very, very quickly. But life has moved on, so a lot of those substances are not available anymore. So we need to work closely at maintaining the storage facilities for the grain stores, to have a advantage in not attracting rats and mice to that building. Proofing is essential. With a good look around your grain store, you need to look at any physical holes in the walls, check the doors, put brush strip on the bottoms of the doors or rubber strip on roller shutter doors, etc. Expanded foam and wire in any holes to stop rodents getting in. But outside the store, it's critical to cut down any brambles, trees, strim or spray off any undergrowth to make sure that you haven't got an easy harbourage area for rodents. And also make sure that if you overfill your store and grain pours out of the back of the store, clear that up quickly, because not only are you feeding the rodents, but of course stored insect pests will focus on that as well. So one good tip for once you've cleared around the outside of your building, some people will dig a meter barrier, and they'll put a plastic membrane drainage stone on there, which rodents feel is very unattractive to rodents to start digging and making burrows into those perimeters. So it's a good idea to focus on your grain store and keep all the undergrowth down, which will help to keep rodents and birds out. Reporting system that we run as a company has an environmental assessment, records the reason why you're doing what you're doing, what pests you have encountered or seen, and what measures you're taking, whether they be physical measures or hygiene measures, clearing the site, and also what chemicals you're using. And of course, if you use baiting around the site, it is important to have a baiting plan. So every bait box or trap is recorded on that baiting plan, so you can see there's a method to what you're doing. Every time that you do what we would call a routine treatment, putting bait down on the farm, it's important to fill a report out. So you can record the date that you've done the treatment, who did it, and what they have done, and including any amounts of chemicals used on the site. Also, a requirement is to have MSDS sheets, product safety data sheets on the in the report book, so that everybody knows exactly what chemicals are being used. And of course, you'd need to show competence if you're doing it yourself, or indeed if it's a professional company doing it. There has to be certificates of competence in that book to prove that the people doing it have got sufficient training to carry out that work and to show that they know what they're doing. Now, of course, again, as I said earlier in the notes, it's important to be aware of what is happening in your own grain store, because there will be a short window of opportunity where you can see what has happened. And of course, the months fly on very quickly. Before you know it, you're filling the grain up, you're filling the store up with grain again, and you'll miss the opportunity to put some of these things right. This slide shows where water has run down a grain walling, and that grain would have started to ferment, encouraging insect pests, etc. It's important that that doesn't just get cleaned away and forgotten about, but you solve that problem so you don't end up having this problem yet again. Unfortunately, some grain stores seem to get bugs every year, so they're fumigated regularly, but it could be avoidable if only people notice these little corrections that need carrying out in the store. Cleaning is absolutely critical for pest control in grain stores, and it's something we've carried out for a very, very long time. And I know that a lot of people like to carry out their own cleaning, but cleaning means top to bottom. You need to clean the roof, the steel work, the purlings, because often on top of the purlings there'll be grain sitting around. Some grain stores have electrical cupboards where dust and debris will get. You need to open up all the ducting. You can see on this slide it's got aeration floors. You need to open up the ends of those and blow all the stuff out from underneath those floors, vacuum the wind tunnel. And you'll see my operative there using a compressor. Brushing alone will not shift all the dust and potential insects that are sitting in cracks and crevices. An airline, I think, is critical for achieving that. So we would blow that grain store down right from the top of the apex of the roof, down into the eaves, top of the grain walling, grain walls, behind the grain walling. You must look behind there as well, any cavities. And then vacuum everything away. And the important thing is, once you've vacuumed your store out, that you take the sweepings and put it well away from the grain store, because that will be where your insect eggs, etc., might be lurking. And please do not put those sweepings just outside the door of the grain store. Before you know it, the insects will be walking straight back in again. So that is, have your teleporter bucket to hand and take it well away from the farm and get that away. Grain store treatments with insecticide. As we have cleaned our store out, we need to make sure that we've given every opportunity we can to stop insects from breeding in that store. As we've heard from the talk that Ken did, some insect pests such as sawtooth, grain beetle, etc., can live a very long amounts of time without food. And after harvest, they're good climbers. They will climb up into the RSJs, up into the roof, and await food supply to arrive so they can drop onto it and start feeding again. So an insecticidal treatment is important to give good protection pre-harvest. And again, as Ken said, that shouldn't be done 24 hours before the grain goes in there, but best to carry it out a few weeks before that grain comes into store, because we're using a residual insecticide. We mainly use K-Obiol for this treatment, and it has a good professional residual life, so that it will keep killing and make sure insects don't reinfest the store. You'll see on the picture here, we're using the first slide is using a sprayer which can spray several meters up into the air, but we also use misters or fogging if appropriate to do so as well. I should note there's also on this slide that of course we can carry out organic treatments. There is a growing number of organic stores out there. We do follow the same processes. I would say that if you're treating an organic store, the cleaning is absolutely critical, because the physical side of pest control there is more important than anything. But we do have formulations that we use through organic equipment so that the two never cross over, to carry out organic treatments. And we do, once the treatments have been completed, we do give a certificate to make sure that people that you know that what chemical is being used, if any, and you can show that to red tractor assessors and so on to prove the work has actually been carried out. We've cleaned our grain store. We have sprayed it pre-harvest, and now the grain is in store. And as soon as that grain is in store, monitoring should start. One of the most important things is temperature, because we want to get those temperatures down as quickly as we can. So I would say that weekly monitoring would be best to start with, so you can capture any of the warmer areas of the store and put fans on that are appropriate. Also, as soon as you've got your grain, your monitoring starts, you need to start looking for insect problems as well. Personally, I think sieving is one of the best ways of trying to find insects in grain. Knowing your heap of grain, a lot of grain is pushed up nowadays with teleporters that could be certainly 4, 5, 6 meters high. There's no air movement much in the heap. Insects will always try and get to the high points in that store. So with sieves, you walk over your store. Rather than rely on just a pitfall trap, you can actually take large samples of grain, and you will quickly see whether you've got anything in there. So I think sieving is very important, to know your heap of grain. Also, when you walk over the grain, when you get to the areas that are particularly firm underfoot, you know that probably is where, if anywhere in the heap, that's where problems will exist. Now, you'll see the picture with the operative with the grain monitoring equipment. He's got a Sinar spear there. That is a great bit of kit. But it's very important to note, whenever you use the Sinar spear, it's always best to do the moistures first. Take your moisture reading, change your setting for whatever crop you're actually trying to monitor. But do the moisture sampling first, because that will be fairly instant, and then go on to the temperature setting, because it takes a little while for the machine to register exactly what that temperature is in the heap. So you can do a quick temperature check and then realize that actually you've not been as accurate as you could be with your temperature. So that's very, very important. Types of monitoring equipment. So I'll talk about the different types of monitoring equipment. Pitfall traps, most commonly used, very, very good bits of kit, but they do need to be used correctly, and that correct way is to just bury them slightly under the surface of the grain. We go to too many farms where They're sticking up like an ice cream cone, and the insect has a hell of a job to get up and walk across the top of the pitfall trap to get in. And they must be slightly under the surface of the grain to allow insect movement over the top of the trap. And it's important to put a good marker in there above those pitfall traps to make sure they don't get loaded up with the teleporter and end up on a grain lorry and stuck in somebody's auger on a further down the line. The important thing is it's recommended that one pitfall trap per 100 tons of grain. And I suppose most commonly, if we go into a 500 ton store, there'll be 4 or 6 pitfall traps in there. But do make sure that they are sighted correctly and thoroughly over the store. If you suspect that you have got an insect problem in there, I wouldn't just rely on a pitfall trap. I would bury a probe trap. You'll see 2 of those in between those pitfall traps on that picture. With those, you can push those down into the grain so that you're not relying purely on surface movement of insects. So they normally go down about 2 feet in the grain, but a very good indicator whether something's happening underneath. We've also got a picture there of a grain sieve, and you'll see that the darkness in there is actually insects that have been sieved out. It's very important, particularly in frosty weather, to warm those insects up to make sure they're actually alive. You know, it's very easy to take a sample and then think that everything is okay, but the chance are those insects will be alive, and either bringing them into the car, putting them under the blower on the heater, or putting them under a red heat lamp or something like that to bring them alive. Then with a magnifying glass you can identify exactly what those insects are. I would point out that message to farmers really, there should never be lorries rejected with insects. I think with good sieving of grain, the day or 2 days before those grain lorries come, with a good set of sieves, you will know if insects are in that grain. We all know that the rejection of a 29-ton lorry load of grain is going to cost probably £300 plus. Nobody wants insects in grain. It's not an advantage to anybody, so I think sieving is critical to give you a quick look at your grain prior to those grain lorries coming, to avoid rejections. Insect pests. I won't talk too long on this because Ken has very professionally told you all about the different pests. All I will say is that grain weevils, which we don't come across very often in well-cleaned grain stores, they are consequence of old grain, might be a mill and mix on the farm where the grain has been sitting around a long time, where that's got a high moisture content, and you won't always notice the weevils because of course they have laid their eggs in the grain. We're waiting for them to hatch out. So with grain weevils, they cannot fly and they will lurk in the damp, stale areas of a store where hygiene is not very good. The next slide is sawtooth grain beetle. They don't fly, but they are very, very good climbers. They are the insect pests that can often catch you out, again, with poor hygiene in the store because of their ability to hide up in the eaves and that sort of thing and drop down on the grain afterwards. So one to watch out for when you think you've cleaned your store just to the height of the grain walling only. Beware that the sawtooth beetle could be lurking far higher than that up in the store. The next one underneath that is a foreign grain beetle, which I suppose is the most common beetle that we encounter in grain stores and the most common that we are fumigating grain against. Foreign grain beetle, like damp grain, all insects have a high water content, high moisture content. They look for dampness in the grain, but they are good flyers and they infest a store very quickly. They don't eat the grain. They do tend to live on. They do live on molds and yeasts. So when you've got wet patches on grain and so on, foreign grain beetles soon find that to be very, very attractive. Grain cooling. We've spoken about trying to get your fans and things on the cold nights after harvest, but of course some grain is stored on solid concrete floors with no underfloor ventilation or aeration. So screw-in spears are necessary for hot spots. Hot spots, again, if you walk through the grain, you'll feel the heat on your Wellington boots, etc. But also you might see the green growth, as in the pictures here. Grain should be ideally stored below 10 degrees centigrade in order to avoid having insect pests. And if you do get insect pests in the grain, it can heat up very, very quickly, and also the moisture levels will go through the roof. So if you see any growth on top of the heap, remove that first. If you get a hot spot, screw-in spears are probably the best thing that you can do to counteract that. And one tip to help those spears work a lot better is to spread some plastic sheet, sellotape it around the base of the spear, of the spiral, and then spread it over the heap a bit. That will suck that heat out over a bigger area rather than just rely on it around the spear. Again, know that heap of grain, look out for changing temperatures, hot spots, where perhaps you might have got some moisture from dripping through the roof or something like that. Look out for that growth. The important thing is get that growth off as quickly as you can. So further pictures to avoid grain problems. You'll see the gentleman on the top of the heap with a shovel. Sometimes if you do get a hot spot, that's a pretty good indication of a hot spot. It's a cold day and you can see the steam coming out of the spiral. But also you might dig into the grain a little bit to naturally let some of that heat out. But it's important to do so because your grain is cooking, and when it gets to 45 degrees in that heap, then deterioration of that grain will happen very, very quickly. And effectively the grain is starting to compost. And not only it might be rejected, but it might be rejected as in it is no good for buying. So unfortunately, we do see a few stores where things go terribly wrong over a year. Watch out for that. And again, the slide on the other side, you can see pictures of growth. Farm assurance standards. Now, of course, all that we've talked about is helping you to gain approval for might be Task, Red Tractor, or FEMAS. Virtually every bit of stored grain is assessed these days for some sort of assurance standard to enable you to sell it. So all of the things that we've talked about in the slides have a great importance on enabling you to achieve those standards. So unfortunately, if perhaps all else fails and you do find insects in the grain, the only solution might be fumigating that grain. It's a very professional service. There aren't many companies in the country that do this, but and all of the staff that carry out fumigation have to undergo lots of training and certification because it's a dangerous process. So a fumigator will assess your store for fumigation. We would use aluminium phosphide, which we put into the heap to kill any form of insect life in that store. Got some pictures here of fumigating a grain store. The process basically is that we put aluminium phosphine into the grain. That might be as a blanket, a belt. We use plates in commodities, and then we encapsulate that stored grain with a plastic sheet to keep the gas levels high over a period of normally 14 days. We carry out a risk assessment of the site, and we would always set up a 5-meter exclusion zone around the grain and lock up the store, hopefully take the keys away with us rather than leave any on site. And then we come back 14 days later to inspect the grain, remove the gas residues, then sieve the grain to make sure there's no active insects still in that store, and then we would provide you with a gas clearance certificate. So here is a gas clearance certificate, post-fumigation, signed off by the fumigator in charge. And the important thing to note here is that if ever you have grain fumigated, you should photocopy the gas clearance certificate, and a copy of that should be fastened to every grain passport for each lorry of grain that leaves the farm. because if dead insects are found at the destination where the lorry is tipping, if they can see the grain has been fumigated, then the chances are you won't get a rejection, because they'll accept the fact that there are dead insects in there, but they've been killed professionally. Therefore, they're not putting their heap of grain at risk of you contaminating it. So that concludes my talk. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found the information interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was great, really good. And we're going to pass on to Dan, who's the founder of Cotswolds Distillery, to talk about the distilling process, barley to whiskey. So over to you, Dan.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've never followed up a talk on pest control, though my wife might tell you differently. But I am here to tell you a little bit about making English single malt whiskey. Who knew? And making it from local grain, and the importance that local grain local barley plays in our process. So a couple of things first, just to get clear. You might be wondering about the accent. It's a very far west country accent. I grew up in New York City, and I had a 30-year career in finance, which took me from New York to Paris and to London, and then really not loving it all that much, and wanting for a change to do something that I loved and to actually make something that I loved. My wife and I decided to move to the Cotswolds, where we had a little farmhouse up in the North Cotswolds, well, we originally actually bought it for weekends, and one weekend in 2012, when I was out there, I was looking out on a field of spring barley that was growing, that the farmers who farmed the area around us had growing, and it was waving in the breeze. And I'd always been a bit of a whiskey geek, and I particularly followed one Scottish distillery called Bruichladdich out on Islay, that had always really made a big point of the issue of terroir and provenance, and where the product is made and where the ingredients come from. And Bruichladdich had gone so far as to actually make a whiskey out of Islay grown barley. And Islay, as probably a lot of you know, isn't the easiest or most likely place in the world to be growing barley. It used to, but the folks at Bruichladdich brought it back, in effect. And so this summer afternoon in 2012, looking out on this field of barley, I suddenly had an epiphany, and I said, you know, they grow a lot of barley in the Cotswolds, and there's 30 million visitors a year. Why has anyone never put up a whiskey distillery and made whiskey with that barley? And out of that epiphany, and sort of came what is now pretty much the top selling and still a very small group of English whiskeys, but we are selling in 40 countries around the world. We're available in Sainsbury's and Waitrose. We're going to be soon available next month, I think, in Tesco's, and it's really been a great growth story. And true to my word, every bit of that whiskey is being made with grain that grows very locally to the distillery. My big problem was that I knew how to drink whiskey, and I knew how to visit distilleries, but I didn't actually know how to make it. So I managed to find a couple of great Scottish mentors, who between them had 100 years of whiskey making experience, who helped us to sort of spec out the kit that we needed, which is very traditional, whiskey pots that have been built up in Scotland by hand. And put the processes into place to be able to go ahead and distill, to mash and distill. But then the big challenge was to find that grain that I had thought about. And the first thing I did is I called a couple of the better known sort of big maltsters, the Bairds, the Simpsons, etc., and asked them if they'd be able to supply me. At the time, I was only looking for 150 ton a year. We've doubled since then. But to ring fence it to get it from a specific local grower, and to ring fence it for the whole of the year and give it to me in little batches. And the phone sort of went dead. And after being hung up on a few times by maltsters, I thought to myself, what am I going to do? And what I ended up doing was finding my closest maltster, which happens to be Warminster Maltings, just outside of Bath in Wiltshire, which I believe have the title of the oldest working maltings in the UK. And they invited me down. They were very interested to talk about the project, and I went down, I drove down, and completely fell in love with who they are and what they're about. So They are floor maltings. Warminster had been owned, I believe it was by Guinness, and then in the whole Guinness Grand Met Diageo thing got spun off and bought by Robin Appel, a well-known local grain merchant, and was always sort of his bijou, and it really is a bijou. I mean, if you have a chance to go and visit it, it's like stepping back in time. They have 3 or 4, I believe it is, 10-ton malting floors, and everything is done in the old-fashioned way, in the way in which a whiskey geek, somebody who really cares not just about the whiskey, but about how it's made, why it's made, would really, it would resonate with. So we're very proud to say that 100% of the barley that goes into our whiskey is locally grown and is floor malted. And it gets brought up to the distillery where we have 2 17-ton silos. And we mill it, we mash it, we ferment it, we distill it, we cask it, age it, and bottle it, all in a very small distillery up in the North Cotswolds, which would invite you all to come and visit. We're very visitor friendly. We have a beautiful visitor center, a cafe. We run 3 tours a day, 7 days a week. And in those tours, one of the things that we really focus on is our relationship with our farmers. So our barley is grown for us by the Green family, 5th generation tenant farmers on the Blenheim estate. So about 15 minutes away from us, near the town of Coombe in Oxfordshire. And we also now are getting a little bit of it from our friend Adam Henson of Country Farm fame. So Adam's farm grows barley, and we take some of Adam's. We've worked with a couple of other farms. We work with the varieties, the malting varieties that are currently in sort of circulation. So when we started, that was very much Odyssey, and we've now moved on to Laureate, and we may move on again. We've also done some interesting things with a 100-year-old sort of variety, Plumage Archer, which we got from Home Farm, which is the Prince of Wales. And to the extent that we can experiment with different varieties and pass on the sort of the message of how important it is to be able to source locally. And there's the guy who sort of created that whole focus at the Brook-Laddie Distillery in Islay has gone on to build a very interesting new distillery in Ireland called the Waterford Distillery, where he's taken the idea to his extreme. This is Mark Renier, who is basically now sourcing barley from, I think, 60 different growers, 60, and issuing parcels of whiskey from each farm. So it's sort of single farm whiskey. Mark's also funded a study to sort of talk about, to be able to prove scientifically that terroir, i.e. the type of soil, the type of climate, the lay of the land can be detected in the barley, in the taste of the whiskey. Now, I've never gone quite that far, and I realize that making whiskey involves a lot of different things. I mean, essentially, we are cooking that barley. We're pouring 3 lots of hot water over it at successively higher temperatures to basically strip all of the fermentable sugars out. We're creating a wort. We're then using multiple yeasts to bring the alcohol out, and the type of yeast and the length of the fermentation and the temperature of the fermentation all will affect very much the quality of what is essentially the beer that we're making. The ABV, specific gravity, and most of all the esters and that are in there. And then we will then, after a very long 4-day fermentation, we go extra long to build in as much flavor from the ambient, the airborne yeast at the distillery as possible. We will then double distill in the Scottish tradition in our 2 beautiful copper pot stills, and the cuts that we make when we're distilling in terms of the bit that we keep to cask, all of these things will very much affect the flavor. And probably the most important thing in whiskey, probably 2/3 of the taste of a whiskey is determined by what type of cask it's aged in, where it's aged, and how long it's aged. So, with all of these things that affect the flavor, would I be the person that goes out there flying the flag of sort of terroir over everything else? And I would have to say, no, I wouldn't. But as an entrepreneur and as a small sort of businessman, as somebody who's doing this really for the love, because there's easier ways to make money than making whiskey. It's a long-term game, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy financially. It's a 5-year working capital cycle. But does it make me happy to source locally? Absolutely. And most importantly, we are trying to differentiate our whiskey, both by the way we make it, the artisanal way in which we make it in small batches, manually. We have no computers at the distillery. We're controlling the distilling process. So we're trying to distinguish it by its flavor credentials, its artisanal credentials, but most importantly by its authenticity. And authenticity these days in premium consumer goods is playing an increasing role, particularly with the focus, and especially last year with the pandemic, on e-commerce and on online purchase. People have the time and they care about understanding how things are made, what they're made from. What I have found is that our message really, really resonates with our consumers. They really do care that we're using local barley. And, you know, we feel that the kind of relationship that we're able to form with our growers, where we know that we're getting their best crop and they're very happy that we're kind of putting their name out there in lights and featuring them and focusing on them and talking about them. So it's a sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. Which we'd love to see, you know, a lot more of in this country. And we'd love eventually to see a situation where we can actually kind of have the capital to go ahead and sort of, you know, put a quota in and actually order, you know, what we're looking for, and focus our decision in terms of variety on flavor and not on, you know, as is now the case, you know, mainly yield and resistance. So very important for us, and I hope something that's of interest to you. For more information on our process, really we're very transparent, and we talk about how we make our whiskey and the grain, etc. It's all on our website, which is www.cotswoldsdistillery.com, where you can also buy yourself a bottle if you're so inclined and would like to see what English single malt whiskey tastes like. And more than anything, we'd love for you guys to pay us a visit. We're in a beautiful part of the North Cotswolds, about 20 minutes south of Stratford-on-Avon, and the summer is a great time to do that. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I wish you a good rest of the day.
That's great, Dan. Thanks very much. Great little presentation. So thank you. Okay, well, that's the end of our speakers from a presentation point of view. But we've got an exciting live Q&A ahead of us now. So this is the well, exciting, maybe nerve-wracking bit where we get your various questions and pose them to our panelists here. Okay, over to our Q&A panel here. And we've been joined by Tom, Farmer Tom, as he's known in the industry. Hello, Tom. Welcome on board. Tom's here to give us a farmer's perspective to some of the questions that we're going to be getting. But Tom, I gave you a little intro right at the beginning, but for those that are viewing, maybe you want to just tell a little bit about yourself and also the good work you're doing with your charity.
Thank you, Roger. I'll just be very brief. I'm a mixed farmer from Cambridgeshire. We grow combinable crops, and we have sheep and host a few cattle during the summertime. But Farmer Time is the project that we started here on this farm just a few years ago. Lovely to see the logo behind you, Roger. Thank you. It's very kind of you.
Yes.
It's I never know which side. It's a project where we basically pair farmers and classrooms. So each farmer has their own class, each class has their own farmer, and there's 600 pairings at the moment. And we do roughly fortnightly video calls. So the farmer will find out what the children are studying, be that genetics, soils, evolution, natural selection, weather, climate change, insect, grain store pests, whatever it might be, and we'll go somewhere appropriate on the farm and have a video call, much like this, just introduce where they are and answer the questions that the children invariably have. So it's been great. We're always looking for more farmers, so if there are any farmers that want to sign up, farmertime.org is the way to do that. But thank you for having me. It's been great and fascinating talks. I've really enjoyed them. Got a list of questions, so
Fantastic. Yeah, no, they were great talks. And in the chat section, Mark, you get a special mention from Michelle Pope, saying it's very interesting and informative. So special little mention to you there, Mark. Okay, so shall I crack on? I'm going to need my glasses for this, unfortunately. But Let's find the first question. So I'll start with Tom Rash. Recently had a load of barley rejected with rice weevil. Is this a common problem? Can you answer that, Mark? Is that something your business sees?
Are we sure they're rice weevil? I would say, first of all, rice weevil is a problem, but often associated with rice, of course. So,
yeah.
If there is a weevil problem, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Mark. Yes.
If there is a weevil problem, then it's going to be down to a little bit of hygiene there somewhere, and it would need fumigating. Because the trouble is with weevil, the eggs will be in the crop, and therefore it will. You can't do an admixture with spray or anything.
Yeah.
You could send the photo in and we can identify it if you wish.
Yes, that's a good point. We do have a service identifying insects should anyone need insects identifying. Okay, next question. How important is it to clean down grain store roof spaces, joists, etc.?
I would say that it might. Is that to me?
Whoever wants to go first.
Well,
Over
Mark,
to you, Mark, first.
You take that one.
Well, I would say it's critical. Once you start using an airline in a grain store and you see what comes down off the roof, then you realise how important that cleaning is. You might look from the ground, think it looks clean, but when you start blowing, you realise how much stuff's coming down. So yes, I would say it's critical.
Yeah, and I agree, and I just add to that. You know, it's often the case that the walls, the floor, the ledges of the grain store are clean, and like Mark said, the roof space and the trusses, the rafters, etc., are often left. And usually, heat rises. We know. And insects will harbour up there because it's often warmer up there as they overwinter as well.
Is there anything you want to add, Tom? I'm sorry to put the sort of spotlight on you, but do you, you know, if you're carrying out the treatment, do you get it to the top of the roof?
Well, not previously, but we will be now. I've just put up a grain store with a very high roof, so we'll have to work out how we do that. But I suppose I had a slight follow-on question from that, and actually, Ken, it was really interesting learning more about some of the insect life cycles and etc. I still can't work out where they come from, where they hide in the kind of the rest of the year. We only have grain in the shed for 4 to 6 months, and I'm still unsure as to where they are. But if you get insect mortality below 5 degrees Celsius, and I've got an empty store during the winter time, should I be, you know, we just had -6, -7 here a few weeks ago. Should I be trying to get the grain store open and really chill it down and try and knock as many on the head during that time as well? Or should I be waiting until those 6 to 8 weeks before I'm getting grain into the store to be acting on that?
It's a difficult one, that, because by opening up the stores, even if it's empty, you're potentially inviting birds and rodents in there through open spaces. I think it's more down to cleanliness and hygiene and getting as much dust and debris out of there. If they haven't got the harbours, they haven't got somewhere to live, you know, they won't stay in that store. So it's a tricky one without actually seeing your store and looking at it.
Now, I'm just interested if there are things I can be doing through other times of the year when insect populations are at a natural low in the middle of winter to be trying to reduce them as much as possible. But yeah,
I think all I would add to that is clean. Really, you know, check the equipment, the teleporter. You only need a crisp packet amount of grain somewhere where those insects will be, and you know, once we're invited on a farm, you will find those areas somewhere which people perhaps, when they're busy running their day-to-day farm, will overlook.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier in my talk, you know, the grain store is critical, but it's also the equipment as well. Even a combine parked in the shed with debris in it from the previous year can harbour insects.
when we're sorry, Roger, just another question related to that. Then, when we're having the grain store cleaned out or fumigated, then should I make sure I've got as much of my harvest equipment in there so that that can be treated at the same time, or should I get it all out of the shed and try and leave the shed as empty as possible so I can actually be targeting the fixtures and fittings of the grain store?
I would certainly recommend that the equipment is washed down, that you pressure wash the teleporter, etc. after harvest, so there is no grain stuck in the wheel arches or anything like that. Particularly with combines, people are not going to wash the combine out, but blow everything out outside. But as I've said before, get everything away from the store. If you're going to, don't leave any grain residues within a few meters of the store, because that's where your insects will be. During sort of May, June, July up to August, those insects are not going to die. They'll thrive outside as they will inside, and then they're just going to walk in the door. So that's, be mindful of things like that as well.
Tom, you're doing a far better job than me. So if you do have another question, please pose it. I've got a couple more, but
oh, well, go on. You share it first, Brother Roger. I mean, it was just so fascinating, and it's a topic that actually doesn't often get a lot of airing. So it's been great. I've got a couple of questions, but why don't you go first, Roger?
I want, and then let's do it. Yeah, absolutely. A bit of branding here. If I apply K-Obiol, there are other insecticides. How long before I can put grain in store?
So you could put it into the store. So I'm assuming the question is about the treatment of a store, the fabric of a store pre-harvest.
It reads that way, Ken. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You could put it in once the surfaces are dry, but you're defeating the object of doing the clean down and the treatment, really. So K-Obiol, as we say, has a residual of 2 months on the structure of a building. So the earlier you can get it onto the building, the more chance you have of capturing the insects as they progress through the life cycle. So we talked about weevils quite extensively. Mark mentioned that they live within the grain. They do about 70% of their life cycle within the grain in the egg, larval and pupae stage, and then they emerge as adults. And it's only when they emerge as adults that they come into contact with treated surfaces, and that's when they're controlled. So the earlier you can clean your store and treat it, if you're doing that, the better.
Right. Thanks, Ken. One more, Tom. I've got a really interesting one here, actually.
Go on.
As seed producers, we manage around 20,000 tonne in store across the country in 50+ growers, farmers stores, some of which, spring barley in brackets, is in store for up to 6 months. Our biggest issue historically is mite infestations, which can reduce the germ. Do you support or have an option on use of diatomaceous earth on cereals in store?
Do you want me to give my?
I was going to say, who wants to give that, but that's quite an interesting question.
Yeah, I can't say I support diatomaceous earth because it's not one of our products in the portfolio. But my view on them is they have their place. So mite are generally in a store on a heap because of high humidity, high moisture content. That's why they're there. They're generally on the surface. So by using diatomaceous earth on the surface and working it in, the mite, it abrades the cuticles, which leads to desiccation. They dry out. But generally mite are there because it's the storage conditions more than anything else. And they're a difficult pest control reactively. So you better be proactive. And again, Mark and myself talked about dryness, temperature. Mite don't thrive or survive where you've got very dry conditions. So I would say that in those stores, because mite feed on the germ of a seed, that's why they're there, perfect conditions for them. You need to look at the overall picture of the conditions rather than just relying on diatomaceous earth to control.
Thanks, Ken. Tom, should we?
Yeah,
a couple more. I've got another couple. This could go on all day, but yeah, no.
let me nip in with a quick one then. I feel like on our farm, I mean, we use Command Pest Control. I never like to see the van on the farm because it tends to mean we've got a problem. And actually, in the last couple of years, we've had to have a couple of fumigations. It feels like we're seeing more infestations now than we've seen in the past. I'm aware that we've had 2 of the wettest winters on record, and quite a wet summer last year. But do you think infestations are increasing? And if so, is that climate related, or where's that coming from? Is that just coming from poor in-store discipline?
Do I feel that they've increased insect infestations you're talking about there? I think perhaps if you've had an insect problem on the farm, it might be something to do with where those insects have ended up, because the chances are we wouldn't have killed all of the insects contained within the grain. And I can't remember, Tom, when we fumigated your grain, so that might have been perhaps if we fumigated during very warm months, the insects might be up the walls. We would normally do an insecticidal treatment as well as the fumigation to counteract that. But, you know, there will be an inherent problem there somewhere if you're getting reoccurring problems. And
I just think, I'm talking to local farmers as well, there seems to be, and it's completely anecdotal, a kind of greater incidence of issues, and I don't know whether that's weather related, climate related, or you know, the ebb and flow of pest populations.
I mean, it's a discussion that we have with farmers, because of course sometimes people will sell grain very quickly, the run up between harvest and Christmas, but then sometimes people will then all of a sudden start storing grain for a lot longer. Their stores might be such that there's not enough air movement within the grain, etc. So that can be a whole host of things, but certainly worthy of a conversation looking at the farm, which obviously we'd be happy to do. Free of charge.
Yeah,
it's a service. It's a service. Can I just say, it's a service that we do free of charge. We don't look to just make a living out of fumigation. We do try and help farmers and the grain trade by using our expertise, looking at grain and trying to just be a help. Really, it goes with the service.
I've got one question for you, Tom, actually, from a guy called Simon King. Where do you get your advice from when it comes to grain store pest protection and pest control in general?
That's a great question, and as with, I think, a lot of things on farm, it's very difficult as a farmer. You're trying to be an expert in everything, and that's never going to work. Actually, at best, we can just consult the experts and make decisions as well as possible. We have a local pest control officer who's been really helpful, and actually I think having conversations with them is really important. I think very often on farms the agronomist can turn up, go home again, and just send you an email, and it can be the same with the pest control officer. And I think actually just having conversations with them is so important. We've piped and filled in a ditch by one of our grain stores, and it was interesting, Mark, to see one of your pictures earlier of vegetation next to the grain store, and we wouldn't have done that if we hadn't had a conversation and looked a bit more closely at the farm and what we can be doing outside, bringing the pest control guy in to deal with our pests. So I think it's probably having actual conversations rather than just feeling like you're employing somebody to do a job and letting them do it. That's been really important. And then, as I say, we've used Command on a tactical basis, as I would term it. And again, I think it's having those conversations, because yes, they may have come to fumigate something, but it might be that they say, you know, have you noticed that you're storing your seed grain right next to where your grain store is, and is there any other way you could do that? And it might be something that's almost a throwaway comment that can improve that. But I'm certainly not an expert. I wouldn't want to try to be an expert, because as I say, as farmers we tend to consult experts in lots of different areas, and I think grain store protection is absolutely one of them, although one again which perhaps has been a bit overlooked by farmers in the past.
I think
Great
you've knocked
question.
the nail on the head there, Tom. I think it's another pair of eyes coming around because you're living on that farm every day. You just sometimes just don't see it, whereas somebody else coming in see it straight away.
Our agronomist says it's amazing the number of farmers who never come out in the field with me, and which is a real shame. And it's the same. It's the same from pest control and grain store protection. I think those conversations are absolutely invaluable.
Yeah, I agree. And just to add to that, from a Bayer perspective, if there's any agronomists out there or the ag chem distributors, you know, I'm available. I'm there. We have lots of support materials. I'm on the end of a phone, email, more than happy to field questions from people and try and guide them and help them wherever we can.
If I can add to that as well, and I'm neither for nor against Red Tractor. I'd be relatively neutral on it. But we, in the past, have used our Red Tractor inspection as well, we've seen it as an inconvenience. Whereas actually in the recent years, we've started to view it as an opportunity to up our game a little bit. And so instead of trying to fudge something or trying to make sure, oh gosh, I'm sure I did clean that grain bucket, I'll write it down, probably it's probably at the first attempt, you know, we've actually used it as an opportunity to up our game. And I think that can be something that you can do to put structure into your year rather than to view an inspection as an inconvenience.
Good idea.
Thanks, Tom. We've just had another question from Jonathan Bainbridge, I believe of Simpson's Malt. I think it might have been slightly covered a little earlier, but I'll pose it to the panel. With global warming changing the atmospheric state, is it likely to have an effect on greater pest populations or a shift in pest varieties that prefer warmer weather?
Shall I go first as the pest controller on that? I would say absolutely right. I mean, bearing in mind I've been doing this job for over 35 years, you could almost wake up years ago and know which season you were in because it would either be warm, cold or moderate. But the trouble is now we're not getting those frosts in the winter time to knock out a lot of pests. We're getting a lot of insect pests, particularly, that used to be knocked out in the winter time that now are prolific. So I would say most definitely yes, the weather patterns have changed, and that is definitely helping pests to thrive.
Yeah, and I'd agree. If I look at our Bayer's professional pest control business, probably the most obvious one in the news is the arrival of the Asian hornets into this country. So there are new pest species coming in. Another one in the paper the other week, I think, is stink bug or something. I can't remember specifically what it is, but that's seen as an invasive species. And yes, the warmer weather, the climate is altering the ebbs and flows of insect life cycles, and seasons less distinct, like Mark said. So yeah, completely agree.
Thank you,
I've
James.
got a question a little bit relating to that, and in fact, we definitely don't want the stink bug in the UK, having been on the receiving end of that particular critter. But there's a fair number of farmers who are changing their farming practice, moving towards reducing tillage. Mark, I noticed earlier you were saying that rats often come in third week in September when we're kind of moving the soil about and starting to get ready for next year, where there's less food and forage for them out in the fields. If we're reducing tillage, if we're going to zero till, for example, then a lot of that stubble is still left out in the fields. Do you think that might change the movement or the migration of mice and rats, or is that just something that happens with the time of year and the temperature?
I don't think it makes any difference to the rats being out in the fields because they will make, once the wheat and barley, etc., has been cut, they'll go to root crops, sugar beet, etc. And then from there, they'll go into the buildings and the ditches and everything else. But it makes a huge difference to the mouse population. Uncultivated stubbles can become totally infested with mice. And you know that by the barn owls, etc., that you see flying around, of which I would say that even on our own farms, that we have got barn owls now on every farm, and I think it is a consequence of obviously more food around. So in theory, that's a good thing out in the fields, but not perhaps so good when they're getting into your grain store.
I was proud of the number of owls that we've got on the farm, but now I'm starting to think it might be pointing towards a mouse problem.
I've got one last question this side. Can I use an insecticide on the building and also on the stored grain? I think that one's for you probably, Ken.
Yes, is the answer. So with again, trying to avoid talking products, but K-Obiol, which obviously is the Bayer product, can be used on the fabric of the building pre-harvest, and then for longer term protection, it can also be applied to the grain as it enters the store in a ULV formulation, and that will protect the grain for up to 12 months. So yes, is the answer. And if anybody wants any specific information, then go to Roger and the team at Lodi as our distributors for that product.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, we're here to help. Anything your side, Tom?
I just thought, what a great way to finish.
Yeah.
Beautifully segued in.
Well, can I just say it's been a real pleasure. The attendees, the viewership has been wonderful, and they've stuck with us all the way to the end. Although we're probably an hour over here, so yeah, no, I'd like to thank all the attendees and especially our speakers. Look, you guys, you're busy men. You're busy men, so I just want to say thank you. Thanks for giving up your time and advising the farming and pest control community out there. I think it's been really, really interesting. So yeah, no, a big clap to everyone that's taken part in this. And here we share the winning photo. So here we have the photo of Lucy, Alan, and Bramble the dog. So a bottle of whiskey is coming your way. I think we've got the details. So absolutely. May I just sort of finish also, look, we're here to help. So if any of the attendees, any viewers or the industry, if you have any further questions or you need any further advice, please contact us at Lodi, and we are more than happy to help. We've got technical advice, and yes, we have contact with Ken, with Mark, and we can pass on any messages that you may have to these guys as well. So yeah, please feel free. Otherwise, I think that's it. I think well done, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us. Few technical hitches, and we're all good. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.